This is the first audience I've ever had of volunteers. Until now, bunches of students have been brought to me. As I talked to them, the kids didn't want to be there, but we talked anyway and they listened. It's very, very nice of you to come out like this. It's somewhat difficult to get started on the subject. The question is, why am I talking at all? And at this point, I feel a little bit like the ancient mariner. I'm a survivor of a disaster of a magnitude that sort of beggars the imagination. There are Holocaust deniers who basically play on that fact that what we claim happened couldn't have happened. No rational people could have done anything like that. And the fact of the matter is that it did happen. The number, to start talking again about the Holocaust, it's become a cliche in some words. We've all heard about it, to hear some more about it. Try to think, when we talk about 6 million people, 6 million Jews who were put to their death in a period from 1938 through 1945. 6 million. Easy number. And we accept it. Try adding to that, or part of that, one of those millions was nothing but children. Just children being murdered. And that gives a little bit of another dimension to it. These were people. By the time I was born in 1936, the Nazis, in Berlin, by the way, I had a terrible taste of getting born in Berlin. The Nazis had already implemented a program that would ultimately lead to genocide. Nuremberg laws had been passed defining who was and who was not a Jew, what Jews could do, what they could not do, and the rules kept multiplying. The appropriation of Jewish properties had proceeded apace, at first in quote voluntarily, then involuntarily when they didn't pull any bones about it and just grabbed whatever they wanted. And then of course, by 2 years after, I was born, by the way, in a Jewish hospital in Berlin, and at the time, a little bit later actually, Jewish doctors were restricted to practicing only in that particular hospital. In 1938, which is the year my mother and I left Berlin, we left after Crystal Night. By now, I think everybody knows what the Kristallnacht was all about. The night after, it was decided by the family. My father and my mother didn't get along very well and had broken up before that. But anyway, my father decided to drive. He had a taxi. He was a taxi driver. He drove us to the border and left us there. The intent was to cross the border following day or night and to make our way to Belgium. Naturally, you couldn't go to Belgium legally. All borders were officially closed to Jews. There had been a conference in which a number of, actually was a conference organized by the United States, took place, I believe, in Switzerland, on various countries admitting Jewish refugees. I think only Cuba and China, I think, decided that they would admit Jews. Belgium, of course, was off limit. However, people made their way into Belgium any way they could. population of Belgium, the Jewish population of Belgium, is generally given at the time, at the beginning of World War II, at about 110,000, of which 20,000 were German refugees, Jewish German refugees. The night that the evening we arrived in this little town off the Belgian border, German-Belgian border, we were supposed to stay at a particular hotel, an inn. There was no room. My mother pleaded. I was 2 years old at the time. I was a cute baby. And she pleaded, and the hotel owner decided that, yes, he could accommodate us up in the attic. So my mother and I guess, we slept up in the attic. In the morning, when we came down, the place had been raided, and all the other Jews who were in there, management, everybody had been arrested. We were the only ones left in this particular hotel. And of course, some of the other, some nearby residents told us what had happened. During the night, my mother carried me across the border. As she described it, there was a certain amount of shooting as she was spotted by some border guards. We don't know whether the border guards who were shooting at her were Germans or Belgian, but she made her way into Belgium carrying me. As I tell the story, I don't want you to think that, whenever a survivor talks to a group of people, the feeling may be that this is somehow a typical story for people who survived. There is no such thing as a typical story. Every story is different. What the stories very often have in common, one of the hidden threads, and here I'm interrupting the story basically, but I belong to a group here in Bergen County called the Hidden Children. We are all people who are no longer children, but who were children then and who lived in hiding in various places and survived. And very often there are discussions of Polish anti-Semitism and Belgian anti-Semitism and so on, and all of that is true. But what all of us, the one thing that we all have in common, is the fact that we were all rescued, we were all alive, because there was a Christian with a conscience someplace who helped us. That's a common thread for all of us. Varian Fry did it because he was hired to do this, and he did a good job and helped many, many, many people that way. But there were many more, of course, who were left behind. And very often the people who did the rescuing, who put their own lives at risk, there is no memory of them. They're unacknowledged. They were just decent, ordinary, decent people who did what had to be done at the time. My mother and I traveled to Brussels. In Brussels, we already had several other relatives. My mother was one of 7 sisters. And 2 of them, 3 of them actually, lived in Brussels at the time. They were also refugees. Am I good? I'm still good? Okay.
More noise back here.
All right.
Crowd here. They want
Okay.
noise up
So, my mother actually had so many sisters because my grandfather had been married 3 times. Not divorces. In those days, wives went quickly. My mother, who in a way is the hero of this story, or heroine, had a simply ghastly life politically. She was born in 1910, which made her 4 years old when First World War broke out. By the time World War I ended, 1918, famine struck Germany, I guess other parts of Europe also, and after which we had a flu epidemic in which she lost her mother. Fortunately, she had older sisters who were older than she was by 10, 15, 20 years, and they raised her so that she would be able to go through the period of hyperinflation in Germany in the 20s. And after that, of course, the Nazi period. One of my aunts, my Aunt Trudy, was the one who was in fact my grandmother. She was my Oma Lula. And she had 2 children of her own. They were teenagers at the time. And her husband, Harry. And they lived in Brussels by themselves at this point because my mother had married, they had me. Even though she wasn't living with my father, they were all in different apartments. I had another aunt, my Aunt Paula, who was quite elderly at the time, lived with her husband, who was your archetypical Jewish tailor at the time. They had a daughter who was cerebral palsied, who excuse me, who spent all of her time in a wheelchair. In those days, there were no schools for physically handicapped. She had somehow taught herself to block print and spent most of her time in a wheelchair writing long love letters to her doctor in block capitals. And of course, the letters never got sent. I mention all of this because these people reappear. My Uncle Nuchem, the father of this family, was employed, after the Germans moved in, was employed by the Germans, since he was a tailor, making underpants for the Wehrmacht. And it was piecework. On certain days, a certain amount of work would be done. The family would get together in the apartment, my aunt's apartment, with old strings through the waistbands of these shorts. And then my uncle would walk down to wherever they collected the stuff, big bundle on his back, and come back with more work. I'm not sure what my mother did, but my first recollection, you have to understand that Holocaust stories very often have a particular pattern. The pattern is usually how sweet life was way back then. Then the Nazis came and ruined everything. Things became very terrible, and now things are getting back to normal. When I came to consciousness, there was no before. The Nazis were it. Those were my first recollections. This was normal for me. I remember the first day of the war. Every now and then I check myself to see if my recollections are correct, because at the beginning of the war, 1940, I was all of 4 years old. What kind of memories can a 4-year-old have? I don't trust them. But where I've been able to check on the facts of my own memory, I've been fairly accurate. I haven't found any major discrepancies. I remember the German planes flying overhead near Brussels. I remember the sound of the bombing, and I remember people saying, oh, the war has started. A few days later, there were German soldiers down, you could see them from the window down the street. And while we knew what was likely to happen, at first, nothing really all that terrible did happen. Life went on. We lived in first one apartment rented to us by Mr. Kornberg, who was a butcher. He had a shop downstairs. We lived up on the top floor. There was another Jewish lady who lived up there. Her name was Frau Stoy. She had a magical mirror. She could tell whenever I came to visit her. I don't know how. I'm 65 years old, and I still haven't figured out how this lady was able to see me through this door. And she would always have some candy for me. But eventually, Kornberg couldn't, for some reason or other, we had to move to another apartment, and it was cold and nastier and so on, but we lived there. After a while, however, we had to move out of there, and so we joined a group of other Jews, friends, relatives, who were looking around for an apartment. I think that Christians were not allowed to rent to Jews, and we couldn't find an apartment, but I remember that all of us eventually moved into one place. My mother had a boyfriend at the time, a man named Ferdi. He had his best friend along. We had, as part of our group, a woman who had been on the St. Louis with her daughter. You all know about the story of the St. Louis? Well, this was one of the people who had been on the boat. I didn't believe her story, by the way. I was a suspicious kid. And I looked up the list of passengers one day just to see if I could find her. And yep, they were there. The big concern, of course, for this lady and her daughter, well, this woman, was not so much the Nazis, but that her husband, who was in Cuba, was going to find out that she had a boyfriend now. You see, part of the madness, really, when you see movies, when you read books about the Holocaust, you think in terms of vast games of cowboys and Indians or cops and robbers, where healthy young people go about their business of evading the Germans. In point of fact, imagine yourself, people just like yourself, with your concerns about children, about parents, about lovers, and life didn't stop while this was going on. People developed relationships. Relationships were broken up. In some ways, the normal processes of life went on, but always in this terrible atmosphere of fear. Well, I tell you that this was normal for me. To try to, it sounds silly, but to get a sense of what it felt like. I don't know how many of you have seen the first of the Planet of the Apes movie. At one point, the humans get chased by the apes and so on. This is what it felt like, constantly. Sheer terror all the time. That was a constant. And more so, of course, for the adults. The children. We were concerned because we didn't have any food. We were hungry all the time. Whatever we found, we tried to see if it was edible. Chunk of wood, let's see if it's edible. Didn't matter. Whatever it was, always hungry. The Germans started conducting, well, first what they did was they got Jewish organizations to register the names of all the Jews. They created some bodies. Supposedly, these were social agencies. The to provide various services for the Jewish population while the Nazis were there. Eventually, there were, of course, instruments of control to help the Nazis get lists of Jews that they could then use for deportation and so on. Now, in Belgium, you see, the Holocaust, I don't like the word Holocaust. Jews tend to use the word Shoah for it. Holocaust suggests some kind of a willing sacrifice. I don't know of any Jews who went willingly. The word Shoah means a disaster, a great conflagration, basically. And that's the word that's normally used, but I'll interchange probably as we go along. In each country, Nazi administration was somewhat different. And who administered a particular country made a difference, the type of government that they had. For example, the Netherlands were under the direction of the Gestapo. And practically all Jews were wiped out of the Netherlands. Very, very few escaped. In Belgium, the situation was slightly different. The country was under the direction of the Wehrmacht, the military. This did not mean that these were saints and that people got away with very much. Ultimately, in about 4 years, from 1940 to 1945, over 50,000 Jews were murdered from Belgium. They were sent to a gathering place, a gathering camp, which in French was called Malines, in Flemish was Machelen. There's a museum there now if you go visit Belgium. And out of, well, my parents were fortunate. I'll give you a little bit. Both my parents, my father wound up in Belgium also. Both my father and my mother managed to survive the whole thing. Of my family, I was the only one whose parents survived the whole thing. All the other children in the family lost their parents. Let me tell you a little bit what happened. Part of the problem was, of course, places to live. Very, very difficult to find. Part of the problem was Belgium, at least Brussels, was a French-speaking country, except for the part that for Antwerp and Flanders, which was Flemish-speaking. Most of the German Jews who fled from Germany spoke neither French nor Flemish. So the Belgians, the French-speaking Belgians, who had no love for the Nazis, were suspicious of them. They thought they might be spies. The Jews who were in Belgium had a problem in that they distrusted everybody. There was no way of telling. There were rewards out for people who turned Jews in. So they trusted no one. They were always afraid. You never knew whether somebody was really going to help you, rent you an apartment, or whether somebody was going to rent you an apartment, then run down to the Nazis and tell you, hey, I've got a bunch of Jews living upstairs. So there was this level of uncertainty at all times. However, things were still better in Belgium than they were elsewhere. It's one of the few places where Jews actually fought back. They joined the Belgian underground. They ran newspapers and disseminated them. And so there was more resistance than there was elsewhere. At one point, I believe it was 1941, letters were sent out to the Jewish population to report to the local police station, blah, blah, blah. People were going to be sent to work camps. And some people, being German, they may have been Jews, but they were also Germans. They were told to do something, they went ahead and did it. Some of them reported, as they were told. Most of them went into hiding and spent the war years in hiding. You had to wear a star, a yellow star. Some people wore them. I never did, not because I was brave and so on, but what with the definition of what a Jew was supposed to look like, even as a kid, didn't quite fit the definition, figured I could get away with it. My parents did also. My Aunt Trudy, the one who was my grandmother, and her husband were amongst the first taken away to Auschwitz. We know what train. The Germans kept records, and you can look up exactly who was on which transport. I think there's something like 25 transports out of Belgium, accounting for about 50,000 people. Of those 50,000 people, 1,200 came back at the end of the war. All the rest perished. Many of them never made it to the actual concentration camp. The trip by train in those cattle cars could take as much as 10 days. And so 10 to 15% of these passengers never made it to Auschwitz. In the streets, there were raids. You went walking along the way, whether or not you wore your star. For some reason, the Germans were able to spot you, and off you went. They raided apartments. My mother one day came back from, she had found a job. We weren't supposed to work, but you had to live. So you tended to work for whatever you could, and she had this job. She went off. She had an apartment with her boyfriend and one of his friends, his best friend. And one day she came back from work, and as she was about to walk into her apartment, some of the neighbors shoot her off. Says, "No, don't go back there." And so she walked in front of the house, and she saw that there were the usual signs indicating that the Nazis had been there. And that was the last time well, before that, the morning when she left was the last time she saw her lover. His name was Freddie. And of course, his best friend went with him also. The Germans got them. They were never seen again. The rumor was that they had gone to Auschwitz. You have to understand that while all of this was going on, there was still a rumor mill. People thought, or you heard rumors about so-and-so being there or having been seen. How this worked, I don't know, because nobody came back till after the war. Still, these rumors prevail.